Okay, we are live.
Good morning and welcome to this webinar, the start of commercially meaningful trade under the African Continental Free Trade Area. This is a webinar presented by the Trade Law Centre Tralak in collaboration with the Mail and Guardian. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Gerard Erasmus, Tralak Associate, who's joining me, Trudy Hartzenberg, I'm the Executive Director. Good morning, Gerard, and welcome.
Good morning, Trudy, and everyone else.
We're going to be providing an update on the African Continental Free Trade Area negotiations. And very importantly, I think we're all asking, when will trade under the AfCFTA begin? So what we will provide, ladies and gentlemen, is an update, most recent news on the negotiating process, and we're expecting the decisions and declarations of the summit, our heads of state that met at the beginning of February, Gerard it was, and made a decision, we understand, for trade to start fairly soon. Gerard, do you want to provide a bit of background on that detail for us?
Yeah, the reason why, thank you, Trudy, the reason why we are anxiously awaiting the outcome of the adoption of this, the results, the declaration of the summit, the AU summit, is that the negotiations about two crucial elements have been going on for some time after the agreement had officially entered into force. The agreement was signed and ratified by the required number of countries about 2 years ago. It entered into force on the 30th of May 2019. But the negotiations for tariff schedules and rules of origin had to continue. And as we are speaking, that process has not yet been finalized. Now, Trudy will tell us a little bit later that a free trade area, for a free trade area to work and to liberalize trade in goods, two essential elements are required: the tariff reductions and the rules of origin. The latter identify the goods entitled to preferential treatment. Now, we must remember that the AfCFTA is an ambitious undertaking. It wants to permit, to allow preferential trade on the whole of the continent alongside some other existing trade arrangements like ECOWAS, SADC, EAC, and so on. But we'll come to that in a minute. But just to summarize, the reason why this outcome is so anxiously awaited is trade under AfCFTA preferences has not yet started. So the indications now are that a sort of interim arrangement will be announced so that for those tariff lines that there is an agreement and there is reciprocity and there will be rules of origin, that trade can start in the meantime. And that is one of the important matters that we want to clarify this morning. As Trudy has said, when can trade start? Well, the answer is, let's divide that answer into two parts. Finally, ultimately, there must be an agreement on the liberalization of 90% of the tariff lines. They are not there yet. But in the meantime, it is vitally important, politically important, to get a demonstration effect that the AfCFTA is providing benefits. I think that is sufficient now, Trudy, by way of answering this first question.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Gerard. Ladies and gentlemen, just to remember that, of course, on the 1st of January last year, 2021, the start of trade was announced, but trade has not yet begun. That is the reality. And the reason is, as Professor Erasmus has indicated, that the negotiations on tariff concessions and rules of origin were not complete. They had not reached the 90% threshold. What we see now is an interim arrangement, taking into account that even though we may not have reached the 90% threshold, we will make a start for commercially meaningful trade. This is the term that has been coined by the Council of Ministers meeting, which took place on the 28th and 29th of January. What we will share with you today is in the public domain, in fact, detailed in quite a detailed press release that was provided for this meeting. And here we see what we expect to be in the summit decision for the announcement that, with a date, that commercially meaningful trade will begin. So this is not yet available on the African Union website. We keep watching every day for those sets of documents. But very importantly also, there are a number of other processes underway. The negotiations continue. On Friday this week, for example, there's an important meeting on intellectual property rights, the IPR negotiations. This will, of course, be an important protocol in the phase 2 agenda of the AfCFTA. Then also on the 13th of January, the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, which is piloted by AfricSimbank, Africa's trade and trade finance institution, lead trade finance institution, was launched. We'll share with you a little bit about that. And we will give you a broader update on the negotiations. First of all, however, what is the status of signature and ratification of the agreement? As Professor Erasmus has indicated, the agreement already entered into force in 2019. What we have seen is a number of countries during the past 18 months or so ratifying the agreement. This means that they have deposited their instruments of ratification with a depository designated in the agreement, and that is the chair of the African Union Commission. So a delegation goes to Addis Ababa and deposits, hands over that instrument of ratification. Most recently, we've had 2 ratifications. Tanzania on the 17th of January, and the most recent ratification has come from Cabo Verde on the 5th of February. So we now stand at 41 ratifications out of the total number of 55 members of the African Union. Of course, one of those, Eritrea, has not signed the agreement. So this is the latest update that we can provide. What then can we share with you from the Council of Ministers meeting? So most important, this meeting was convened and it is currently being chaired by the Honourable Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition from South Africa, Honourable Ibrahim Patel. The overall objective was to take stock of the negotiating process, to assess where we stand with outstanding issues, and to agree on timeframes for the completion of the negotiations, and most importantly for our discussion today, the start of commercially meaningful trade. As Professor Erasmus has indicated, the most difficult negotiations have proved to be on the 2 foundational requirements, the minimum requirements for a free trade area, and those are tariff concessions and the rules of origin. As he's indicated, the rules of origin are in fact those rules which determine eligibility for the tariff concessions, the tariff preferences, which are negotiated in a free trade area. They play a gatekeeper role. If your products comply with the applicable rules of origin, you will trade under the preferential tariff regime. If not, then by default, your goods would attract a higher duty, the duty applicable under the World Trade Organization rates that are applicable for that destination to which you are exporting. At this point, so this was at the end of January, rules of origin had been agreed for 87.7% of tariff lines. So this is a little bit short of the level of ambition that we negotiate tariff concessions for 90% of tariff lines. Important to keep in mind that these are very sensitive negotiations, and the reason includes, for example, that many countries are developing their domestic industries and supporting their enterprises. So what we see is that the level of ambition is associated also with industrial development agendas that all of our member states have. So some may wish to protect their garment industry or their agricultural industry in particular subsectors. And then it becomes very, very difficult to make tariff concessions and also to agree on the rules of origin. At this point, some of the very sensitive products where it's difficult to agree on the rules of origin include sugar, always a sensitive product in trade negotiations, tobacco products. And what we're looking at is a process to expedite those negotiations so that the rules of origin are agreed by March this year. That's next month. Clothing and textiles and apparel. There are a number of very important interests in this collection of tariff lines. Most countries on the continent actually have some garment manufacturing enterprises, and some would like to develop those further. Others also have textile production that they would like to protect. So this has proved to be particularly difficult to reach agreement. The aim at this stage will be that we have rules of origin concluded by September this year. Gerard, over to you.
Well, the next slide tells us a very important story, and that is that the AfCFTA, although called a free trade area, is actually a comprehensive arrangement. It also covers trade in goods. It has a protocol on dispute settlement. And as Trudy has already indicated, there are phase 2 and also phase 3 negotiations in the pipeline. The phase 2 negotiations, very briefly, will cover intellectual property rights, competition, and investment. Now, this press release tells us that for trade in services, the negotiations are in advanced stage of completion, with 46 member states having submitted their schedules of specific commitments. Now, trade in services is vital for the bigger picture achievements. Only about 16% of the goods that we produce in Africa are destined for other African markets. Now, that has two obvious implications. That there is a large opportunity, big space here for boosting intra-African trade in goods. And many of the commentators and politicians have started to emphasize that the AfCFTA is actually a framework for industrialization and development of value chains. Trudy will tell us more about this, but if that has to happen, trade in services is so obviously at the center of such a strategy. 90% of our goods are being transported by road, so services such as transport, communications, payments, and some others that we will discuss later on, they are not only important as boosters of trade in services, they are very important in terms of making it possible and boosting trade in goods, in particular in our part of the world. So together with liberalizing trade in goods, we must do many other things. We must improve trade governance. We must improve the infrastructural and transport networks, the trade facilitation, what happens at borders. And of course, the associated disciplines of transport, payments, information, all of those are vital in order to achieve the bigger objective, and that is to boost trade and growth and industrialization and development on the continent. When we do these things, when we succeed in improving trade governance and adding the additional commitments to the basket that constitutes the AfCFTA, we will not only trade better with ourselves, but with the rest of the world. And we all know that global trade is vital for Africa. So Trudy, I think that is sufficient in terms of introduction, but maybe you should tell us more about these specific services that will be negotiated in order to complete the schedules of the second protocol. The first protocol is about trade in goods. The second protocol is about trade in services, and the third one about dispute settlement, which serves just to remind us that ultimately, from a technical point of view, the AfCFTA is anchored in international agreements concluded among these member states of the African Union. So they will contain legal obligations that must be implemented. And now, what does implementation of a trade agreement entail? It entails that follow-up action must be taken by the member states. Important domestic arrangements must be put in place, such as new columns in the tariff book, providing for procedures to issue the certificates of origin, to qualify with the technical standards, the health standards, the technical standards, the safety standards. So a lot of trade governance will accompany the process of implementation, also the process of interim implementation. Trudy, tell us more about the services, the 5 priority sectors that have been identified, and what you see happening there, please.
Thanks very much, Gerrit. Absolutely right. If we take a look at the contribution of services sectors to all our economies across the continent, including the least developed countries, this has grown significantly in recent years. And for the continent as a whole, services contribute more than half of gross domestic product at the continental level. The 5 priority services sectors that have been agreed by the member states are financial services, transport, communication, business services, and tourism. And as Gerrit has pointed out, if we take a look at finance, communication, and transport services, these are not only important in terms of the contribution that these sectors make to economic activity, employment, foreign exchange earnings, and so on, but they're also particularly important in terms of being inputs into every economic activity. They're also trade facilitating in terms of processing cross-border transactions, payments, and of course, transport of goods into other destinations on the continent. Very important issue about services is that they are regulatory intensive, and that focus on domestic regulation makes these negotiations not only important, but particularly difficult. And unharmonized regulations across the continent in various sectors can add significantly to trade transaction costs and really constitute the equivalent of non-tariff barriers as we would have when we take a look at trade in goods. So these negotiations are still ongoing. There is also an additional track of negotiations which focuses on frameworks for regulatory cooperation. So addressing some of these regulatory barriers that are so important. When transport regulations are not harmonized, it becomes extremely difficult to provide efficient, competitive transport services across borders. So it's not a surprise that these are taking so long, but the other very important point to keep in mind is that there are only 5 priority services sectors at this point. There are very important other sectors such as education services, healthcare services, distribution services, construction services, and many, many others, which are also very, very important, both in terms of the contribution that they can make, but their potential in terms of facilitating trade. Distribution services, so important. Here we're looking at retail, wholesale, and logistics services, which again play a very important trade facilitating role.
Trudy,
many of this, yes?
Could I just ask you, if we are speculating that the declaration that will be issued by the AU summit will tell us, will announce when interim commercially meaningful trade can start, the indication seems at this point that that will not include services. Is that right? So what we are expecting to see will be a staggered interim implementation till everything is concluded. The Council of Ministers directed that the negotiations for trade and services, only for these 5 sectors, should go on till the end of June. Now, there were these deadlines before, and they were not always met. So, is it fair to say that we will see different tracks for trade in goods and trade in services under the interim arrangement?
Definitely. I would expect that the start of commercially meaningful trade refers to trade in goods, and that refers to the 87.7% of tariff lines, the tariff line rules of origin that have been agreed, and the tariff concessions that work together with those rules of origin. This is what we expect to start fairly soon. The services negotiations, we have a deadline of 30th of June. This may well prove to be fairly ambitious, but we'll have to wait and see how those negotiations unfold. Adding additional services sectors, that will happen further down the line. So there is still quite a lengthy negotiating process that has to be completed as far as trade and services is concerned. But we've also got to keep in mind, and Gerard, this is quite important, we have to monitor what is also happening at the regional economic community level, because keep in mind, the regional economic communities and their trading arrangements will continue, and they are negotiating and deepening their own integration agendas. Trade under the REC trading regimes will continue, and that applies to goods and services. So of note fairly recently is that the Protocol on Trade and Services in SADC has entered into force. So SADC is making advances in terms of its trade and services agenda, while we are on the AfCFTA track negotiating the services sector commitments as well. So I think this is quite important to keep in mind. There are some other important issues that have been noted by the Council of Ministers, and we'll note a few of these. And ladies and gentlemen, we will share these slides with you. And if you have any questions, you're most welcome to post them in the chat room and also to contact us afterwards. So some of the other issues which are important to take note of, there is reference to special economic zones. Now, Gerard has mentioned that industrialization has become a very important policy objective, not only at the national level, but it also features very prominently in our regional economic community development agendas. And of course, at the continental level, the flagship project, Accelerated Industrial Development for Africa, AIDA, is a very important development agenda in its own right. Our special economic zones, they have met with various levels of success over the years, but they are again extremely important as one of the pathways to industrialization for many African countries. When an enterprise locates in a special economic zone, it may also be called an industrial development zone or a free trade zone. Of course, that enterprise enjoys specific benefits, and these could be preferential rates on utilities, for example, and many other concessions, giving those enterprises certain advantages over enterprises that are not located in those specific zones. So a discussion about identifying products in the context of the AfCFTA trade regime that have been produced in the special economic zones is rather important. This discussion is taking place in the context of the rules of origin discussions. So this is still a stream of activity that we do have to take a look at as well. Institutions, Gerard, over to you on the dispute settlement body, an update on what has happened in that connection.
Yeah, let me emphasize a point made by Trudy, and that is that the AfCFTA will not replace any of the existing trade arrangements on the continent. That's very important to emphasize. So ECOWAS, the EAC, COMESA, SADC and four others that are mentioned as building blocks of the AfCFTA, they will continue. As a matter of fact, there are provisions, Article 19 of the agreement and Article 8 of the Protocol on Goods, that say these arrangements shall continue and shall advance their own deeper integration agenda. So we are going to see streams of preferential trade on the continent and streams of preferential trade in services too. But a trade agreement, a trade arrangement has all sorts of other associated legal disciplines. There are many protocols and annexes and appendices to deal with all the practical issues, the rules of origin, the NTBs, the non-tariff barriers, the trade facilitation, the customs administration, the regulatory frameworks for services. The point really is that there is still a lot of work to do, and that the AfCFTA will keep us busy for some time in terms of monitoring developments, unpacking the implications, and disseminating information about how things will work. And when we do that, we have to keep in mind that there will be parallel streams, and they will have to talk to each other. We also have a problem of overlapping membership in the regional economic communities. So there are many reforms that will come in the wake of the logic of a continental trade arrangement. Exciting stuff lies ahead. Now, what institutions do we find in the AfCFTA? It does not say, the agreement doesn't say it creates a new international organization, as is often the case, but it does have important institutions like the Council of Ministers, which will be the one responsible for monitoring and issuing directives. All the member states are represented there, and they take their decisions on the basis of consensus. That's very important. Consensus decision making has implications for the speed and the level of new commitments. States cannot be forced to cooperate and to accept obligations that they do not support. So consensus decision making must be noted. We also have the senior trade officials body, and we have a secretariat in Accra. The secretariat is a very fascinating institution. The agreement says it has its own legal personality, separate from that of the African Union in Addis Ababa. The secretariat is based in Accra, Ghana, and what we're starting to see is definite energy and ambition being generated by the activities at this point of the secretariat. Once everything is up and running, the secretariat will have to play an additional important role in terms of supporting and assisting member states and making the whole system work. And there are all sorts of new plans in the secretariat to get involved in some of the matters mentioned by Trudy, such as payment systems, standards, assistance, and then also industrialization. The last one I want to mention is the one in the second bullet, the dispute settlement body that was established by a separate protocol, protocol number 3. Now that one was very quick and easy to adopt and to agree on, and the reason is probably that we're not going to see much action in terms of interstate dispute settlement under the AfCFTA. Not for a long time to come, I personally think. And why am I saying this? It is because it is limited to interstate dispute settlement only. So private firms who can take their disputes to the regional courts in ECOWAS, EAC, and COMESA, and individual persons and companies and private entities, they will have no standing under the AfCFTA dispute settlement mechanism. And the record tells us that our governments never litigate against each other about non-compliance with trade agreements. They have alternative ways and means for settling their disputes, and they are normally about discussions and political talks and using political platforms in the regional economic communities. But I do not think we will see formal disputes being declared under the dispute settlement mechanism of the AfCFTA anytime soon. We will have to await and see what other discussions and means will be used, and the indications are that they will probably be on the agenda of the Council of Ministers. Thank you, Trudy.
Thanks very much, Gerard, for that. The last point on this slide, ladies and gentlemen, just gives a little bit of an update on the overall negotiating agenda and reference specifically to the work in committee. So there's a range of committees that have been established, and they really are focal points for the ongoing work and management of the negotiating process on trade and goods, trade and services, and then also, very importantly, the phase 2 negotiating agenda. And these, as Gerard has indicated, include investment, competition, intellectual property rights, digital trade, and women, youth, and trade. Now, as far as some of these issues are concerned, some progress has been recorded already. So there is, we understand, a zero draft of the protocol on investment. There have been some meetings and discussions. Competition policy, some preliminary work has been done. As I've mentioned, there is a meeting on intellectual property rights later this week. Digital trade, again, background work being done. And very importantly also, the protocol on women, youth, and trade. There is a lot of consultation taking place across the continent with stakeholders to develop the agenda for that protocol. The level of ambition set in terms of time frame is that these negotiations should be completed by September this year. If we take a look at some complementary initiatives, we mentioned the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System earlier. It was launched on the 13th of January 2022. This follows a pilot phase in West Africa. Very important to check how this would work, of course. Commercial banks were involved, as they need to be in a payment and settlement system. And some banks that you may be familiar with, including Standard Bank, for example, from South Africa, were involved in that pilot phase. We'll share with you a little bit on what that would look like. Quite important to keep, particularly if you are a trader, to take a look at progress on that front. There is also, and I think this is particularly important, it links again to the industrialization agenda. A $1 billion facility is being made available by AfCFTA to support a continental automotive value chain development. This is so important to take a look at a number of countries where already we have an interest in the automotive value chain, either in assembly or components manufacture. And so taking a look at how regional and now continental value chains can be developed in a sector such as this could give an enormous push to the industrialization initiative for the continent, but also change the way that African enterprises interact with, engage with, and form part of global value chains. And the automotive value chain is, of course, a truly global value chain. Being challenged, very importantly, as far as green transition imperatives are concerned, with moves to electric vehicles, taking a look at new technologies, and so on. For some existing automotive manufacturers on the continent, this will require transformation, investment in new technologies, new capabilities to be able to move away from the internal combustion engine production facilities that we have at the moment. Overall, there have also been more concerted efforts to engage the private sector in the AfCFTA processes. And of course, that's absolutely critical because at the end of the day, it is the private sector that trades. Very important in the context of the AfCFTA and facilitating trade across the continent, reducing trade transaction costs. bringing efficiency gains, not only in terms of intra-Africa trade, but also our trade with global trade partners, is eliminating non-tariff barriers. Now, this mechanism has been launched some time ago already. It is live as we speak. So it's the NTB reporting, monitoring, and eliminating mechanism. You'll see it looks very similar to a previous portal that was launched some years ago under the banner of the tripartite integration agenda, the tripartite free trade area negotiations, and the tripartite initiative, so tradebarriers.org. It is important that you register so that you are able to log a complaint should the need arise. And if you do have a look at the live complaints, you'll see even though trade under the AfCFTA has not yet begun, traders and other stakeholders have started noting complaints, and resolution of some of those is underway. Harriet, I'd like to ask you to say something about this and the link to dispute settlement, because of course, a major challenge with the resolution of NTBs is that very often the resolution is ad hoc. So my NTB may be resolved today, but in a week's time, somebody else may come to the same border post and experience exactly the same challenge. How do we systemically eliminate, address non-tariff barriers? And this is where the link to dispute settlement is important. Harriet, can you tell us a little bit about that?
You're quite right, Trudy, that this is a reporting, monitoring, and elimination mechanism. Elimination of what? Of administrative measures that are imposed at borders mostly, and sometimes within neighboring countries, in the process of regulating trade in goods. And at this point, it is what is the focus. Now, your concern is well founded. You must give us a practical example soon. But if a truck driver arrives at the border with goods destined for importation into that other country, then of course there must be customs clearance, there must be compliance with standards, taxes, tariffs must be paid, etc. Now, the ideal position, of course, is that all these forms of administration will be digitalized, and that clearance will be expedited. But we all know that there can be measures taken in respect of, let's use an obvious example, an official finding that the paperwork for complying with health standards or rules of origin is not fully in order. Now, then there is a difference of opinion. The truck driver and the system that was gone through in order to undertake that transaction, they will argue that we have done what is legally required and it's all in place. Now we've got a difference. Now we've got a problem. We've got a potential dispute. Now, this system can serve a good purpose by alerting all the officials, and sometimes there are 7, 8, 9 different ministries at the border, about the fact that there is a complaint mechanism. If a complaint is lodged, it doesn't go to a court. It is not decided through judicial process. It is looked at in terms of the reasons, the explanation. There will be an exchange of information. There will be requests for clarifying why this was done. And sometimes they get resolved very relatively soon. Sometimes they can last for years without being addressed. And this is the element that is of concern. You call it a systemic deficiency, and you're quite right. It doesn't bring finality. It doesn't create a legal precedent so that next time another truck driver arrives at the border, that the same practice will not be repeated. So more will have to be done. This is an important transparency mechanism in the beginning, but it doesn't go far enough. It doesn't go far enough. Now, what does the agreement, the AfCFTA agreement, say about this? Well, it provides for this mechanism, and as you have pointed out, Trudy, this is not a new innovation. It has been started some time ago in the trade between SADC, the EAC, and COMESA. So there are examples of this, and we have learned over time that it has certain benefits, but also limitations. What does the AfCFTA agreement say about disputes about NTBs? Well, in principle, each and every aspect of the agreement, the founding agreement, all the protocols, their annexes, their appendices, are justiciable. Disputes can be declared about the implementation or interpretation of any of the legal instruments. And that is what the protocol on dispute settlement allows for, to declare those disputes and then to say, okay, but first you must consult with each other, and if you don't have a solution, then a panel will be appointed and ultimately it can go to the appellate body. Now, the other obvious feature here is that these delays at border posts for trade in goods can result in very serious negative consequences if not dealt with urgently. So urgency is an overall concern. There is a provision in the annex on NTBs that in cases of urgency, matters might be expedited, and it is obviously possible to take this on under the protocol on dispute settlement, to take it further. I do not think that is what will happen now in the near future. What we will hopefully see is that the annex on non-tariff barriers and related matters about trade facilitation and customs administration, because they are so important in the African context for trade governance, that there will be deliberate efforts once everything is up and running and all the negotiations on tariff reductions and rules of origin have been completed, that the energy, the focus will start to shift more towards these governance matters. Let me stop there. It is work in progress, but a lot more has to be done generally for boosting trade in Africa, if we want to boost trade in Africa, about trade governance. And in this context, this mechanism is an important starting point, but we can't stop here.
Thanks very much, Gerrit. And of course, there are also similar portals in other sub-regions of the continent in West Africa, and also being developed at national level to address what is an enormous challenge. In fact, there are studies, and Trellick has done one of these, which confirm that the impact of non-tariff barriers is much more pernicious than the impact of tariff barriers. So addressing non-tariff barriers in a concerted, systemic fashion makes absolute sense. So the priority given to this is certainly to be welcomed. This, very briefly, ladies and gentlemen, is the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, and we invite you to visit that website and to take a look at how this will take place. The aim is that payment, settlement, and clearance takes place in real time in the national currencies of all the participating member states on the African continent. This is particularly important. There are sub-regional payment and settlement systems that do exist already across the continent, and these play a very important role in already facilitating cross-border payments and settlements, but do have a look at how this is likely to work. I want to just in this connection also to refer to Africa's transport sector and the AfCFTA. And this takes us back a little bit to the non-tariff barrier discussion, the trade cost discussion, but also the trade and services agenda. And what we are seeing here is that there are important initiatives to improve transport infrastructure across the continent. Some of the issues are being addressed in the context of the trade and services agenda, where subsectors such as road, rail, and maritime are the focus of the negotiations to conclude sector commitments by the member states. There is also a separate stream of governance focusing on air transport, which is very important for intra-Africa trade, increasingly so. And that takes us back to the Yamoussoukro decision of 1999 and the single African air transport market that was launched in January 2018, just before, in fact, the African Continental Free Trade Area was tabled for signature in March 2018 in Kigali and Rwanda. So the point really is that there are a number of complementary initiatives that we must monitor because they will support the achievement of the AfCFTA objectives. Just a reminder, and some of you will be very familiar with this discussion about the coexistence of the regional economic communities, their trade arrangements, and the AfCFTA. But this is also so important for us to assess where the additional trade liberalization contribution of the AfCFTA will be coming from. And I'm sitting in Cape Town this morning, ladies and gentlemen, over here. South Africa belongs to the Southern African Customs Union, the Southern African Development Community, and within SADC, there are some interesting developments, not only in trade and services, as we mentioned earlier, but, for example, Angola, which is a member of SADC, but not yet a member of that free trade arrangement, is acceding to the SADC FTA. But if we take my location this morning and trade from South Africa to the rest of the continent, then if we are trading with Nigeria, we currently trade under the rules and the applicable tariffs of the World Trade Organization. Those are the most favored nation rates of duty. So this is an example of where the AfCFTA will bring tariff liberalization and improve the conditions for trade between, in this case, South Africa and Nigeria. Keep in mind that both those two countries, some of the largest, most developed countries on the continent, both belong to customs unions. If we take a look at Nigeria, belongs to ECOWAS, the Economic Community for West African States, whereas South Africa belongs to the Southern African Customs Union. So this is so important to keep in mind that here we have the collection of 8 regional economic communities that are recognized both in the African Union context, but also in the AfCFTA. They will continue to exist, and their trading arrangements where they exist will also continue, and we will continue to trade under those arrangements. So South Africa will continue to trade, for example, with Malawi under the rules of the SADC Free Trade Area. Now, some of these do not yet have their own trading arrangements. The Arab Maghreb Union, SENSAD, IGAD, for example, don't have trading arrangements. However, due to the overlapping membership of trading arrangements and regional economic communities, there is some bilateral liberalization among some of the member states in those regional economic communities where the REC does not yet have its own trading arrangement. And Gerard, would you like to say something about these provisions that relate to this discussion quickly?
Yeah, very briefly, Trudy, we are putting this information, and it is taken directly from in this case, the Article 19, Paragraph 2 of the AfCFTA agreement, and this is Article 8.2 of the Protocol on Trade and Goods, just to confirm the thinking, the design. We must understand what the member states wanted to achieve. And here they say quite clearly, state parties that are members of other regional economic communities, regional trading arrangements, and customs unions like SACU which have attained among themselves higher levels of regional integration than under this agreement shall maintain such higher levels among themselves. These arrangements will not be abolished. And that makes perfectly good sense. There's a very high level of concentration of trade in goods and services taking place here. There is another principle in this agreement. It's called the acquis, which is a French word that was borrowed from EU experience. And it simply says that what has already been achieved will be maintained. Here, this provision goes even further. State parties that are members of REX, which have attained among themselves higher levels of elimination of customs duties than those provided for under the AfCFTA, shall, lawyers like this word when it appears, shall maintain and where possible improve upon those higher levels of trade liberalization. This is just to show to you that there is a very important design feature in the AfCFTA, and that is to coexist with what already exists. It doesn't abolish the foundations that have been established over decades. Thanks, Trudy.
Thanks very much, Gerard. I'm going to skip over this one. This is just to confirm, as you've been saying, that intra-Africa trade remains very low by global standards if we compare with other regional integration arrangements across the international economy. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is just the latest data that we have for 2020. Not all countries have reported their full data for trade in 2021. And if you track with me the intra-Africa trade percentage, you'll see we're starting in 2002 at about 12%. And there's some ups and downs, and it peaks in 2015 at 21%. And then, of course, more recently, we see also possibly a COVID impact here, although intra-Africa trade, particularly when it comes to manufactured goods, really demonstrated some resilience. We saw significant declines as a result of COVID in the demand for commodities from our global trade partners when COVID first struck. By contrast, we saw some resilience in intra-Africa trade, particularly in manufacturers. So for 2020, we're putting the intra-Africa trade at about 16% of Africa's global trade. If we look at some of the important traded products, this is just a list of the top 10 traded products, intra-Africa trade, that is, they account for a total of 89% of Africa's intra-Africa trade. So again, we see a high concentration in certain product categories, not only within particular sub-regions. That's quite important to keep in mind. So there is potential to open trade, new trade relationships to be developed. Mineral products, of course, this includes crude oil and related products, plays a very important role, very important trade relationships, for example, between Nigeria and South Africa. We import crude oil from Nigeria. It is refined and then exported again. Some goes back to Nigeria, but also to other destinations. Chemical products, food and beverages, such an important area to focus on for industrialization. So agribusiness, the food processing industries, which play a very important role also to assure food security across the continent. Base metals, machinery, transport equipment, vegetable products, precious stones, plastics, clothing, and textiles is on this list as well. So there is already intra-Africa trade of note in clothing and textiles, and given the ambition to develop this sector for many, many African countries, this could be a very interesting area to focus on as far as value chain development is concerned as well. These are just a few snapshots, ladies and gentlemen, in our last few minutes, and we invite you to take a look at your sub-region. This is the Southern African Customs Union. Keep in mind that as a customs union, the member states make a collective offer of tariff concessions to their trade partners. And this is also one of the reasons why these negotiations can take so long, because first, each individual member state within the customs union has to have consultations with its private sector and stakeholders to discuss the offer of tariff concessions. But then phase two means they have to negotiate amongst themselves to find the necessary compromise so that they can collectively make an offer of tariff concessions. So it's a two-stage process, which is very important for customs unions, such as the East African Community and also ECOWAS. Very important question that we ask in the following slides, and we invite you to have a look at your sub-region. Who is negotiating with whom? Where will those new opportunities come from? So in the case of SACU, we really are looking at a situation where all SACU member states also belong to the SADC Free Trade Agreement. So they will negotiate with member states outside of that Southern African region, outside of SADC. That's where the new liberalization will come for them. We do a similar exercise for ECOWAS. ECOWAS, take a look at its trading arrangement, the ECOWAS Trade Liberalization Scheme, the ETLS, that's for intra-ECOWAS trade. Who will they be negotiating with? And they'll be negotiating with some customs unions, including SACU, but also with individual countries, countries that don't belong to a customs union because they make their own tariff offer. So a country like Mauritius, it negotiates on its own, as does Mozambique, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and others. East African Community, again, it's a customs union, and so it negotiates collectively with other trading partners. We're coming now to the end of the presentation. This is the Central African Economic Monetary Union, CEMAC, an important monetary union. Very important to have a look at that as well. And here we are at the conclusions. Gerrit, can I hand over to you in the last couple of minutes to draw some conclusions for us?
First point to mention is there is a higher level of ambition and political and practical activity around the AfCFTA. These negotiations have been launched, I think, in 2015 already, and maybe we are a little bit concerned sometimes about the fact that it takes so long, but it serves as a reminder that the matters that are on the agenda are important, are complex, and if countries at very different levels of economic development have to agree on the basis of consensus, it is not surprising that it is a difficult exercise. So that is the political spectrum. The practical question is, what will be the trade opportunities? At the end of the day, governments don't trade. Well, they are involved in matters such as public procurement, and in that sense, they are relevant for trade in the traditional sense of the word. But the decisions that are made about investments, about new import and export opportunities, the activities of service providers, decisions about commercial presence and investment, those are taken by the private sector. So where will the opportunities lie? What will happen? What will be unlocked by this important initiative? We are optimistic that once the political side, the governments have concluded and put the basic building blocks in place, that an energy that the private sector will be able to exploit and to use those new opportunities. But let's conclude, as far as I'm concerned, with a caveat. Trade agreements don't guarantee trade, and they are not self-executing. What governments will subsequently do in terms of disseminating information, making sure that the certificates are issued, that the borders are run better. In other words, reforms about trade governance and unlocking the energy between services and trade in goods. Those will be the areas that will determine the success. So groundwork can be provided by this very important initiative, but that in some senses, in some ways, will only be the start. And the private sector ultimately will have to be the engine for the success. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gerrit. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our webinar. I see some extremely interesting questions in the chat room. Some of them we'd be happy to answer if you contact us. And I think you'll find our details on the TRALAC website. That will be available in the PowerPoint presentation. Just one I'd like to mention, someone is asking, is the agreement available? Yes. The legal instruments are available on various websites, including the TRALAC website. So we invite you to find them there. There is another question about non-African companies established in the state parties. Can they register on the NTB mechanism? This is a very important question. There is a lot of global interest in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, in the AfCFTA and what it will mean both for investment location decisions, and market access to the bigger markets that the AfCFTA is expected to develop, to contribute to developing. When a foreign company establishes commercial presence in one of the state parties, it gets access to all the benefits under the AfCFTA. That's so important. So it's domestically incorporated. It then has access to all the benefits under the AfCFTA and can very definitely register on the NTB monitoring portal. So please do that in advance.
And those companies can also avail themselves of benefits, trade arrangements, and administer the benefits in other African countries. So if you are registered in country A and you export to country B, but you are not registered in country B, that's not necessarily the end of the story. The dynamic effect here is to reap the benefits of being incorporated.
Thanks very much, Gerrit, for that. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our presentation. Please watch out for other webinars that TRALAC will be holding on the African Continental Free Trade Area, but also on related topics. So later this week, we have a webinar on the SADC Protocol on Trade and Services. Do watch out for the details, and we hope to see you there. Thank you so much, and have a good Tuesday.
Thank you, and goodbye from me.